Maplewood Diner had always been a well-loved place in town, famous for its timeless American breakfast and its cozy booths that welcomed all who came. The diner had been running for years, but not many people were aware of who truly owned it. Most assumed that the man who was always seen behind the counter, Mr. Harris, the head manager, was the one in charge. But in reality, the true owner, Daniel Carter, preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Although he owned several restaurants, Daniel was not one to flaunt his success. Instead, he would often slip into the diner wearing casual clothes, blending in with the regular customers. He wanted to see how things were running, without anyone knowing who he was. One afternoon, Daniel strolled into the diner wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, fresh from a meeting. He hadn't come to announce his arrival, but instead to observe things from the perspective of a regular customer. For him, it was the best way to get a true sense of how his businesses were really doing. As he settled into a booth near the window, enjoying the familiar vibe of the place, a waitress named Jessica approached. Jessica had been working there for over a year and had a reputation for having a bit of an edge to her. She sized Daniel up, giving him a quick once-over. Unlike the other customers who had already been greeted and served, Daniel was left waiting without so much as a menu. Jessica crossed her arms and, with a certain attitude, said, "Before I take your order, you'll need to pay up front." Daniel raised an eyebrow, his confusion clear. "I'm sorry, what?" he asked, genuinely surprised. "It's just our policy," she replied, shrugging nonchalantly. Daniel looked around the diner. Other customers, many of whom were white, had already ordered their meals without having to pay up front. His expression remained calm, but inside, he felt a wave of disappointment. "I don't see anyone else paying before they eat," he remarked, keeping his voice even. Jessica hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously. "Well, sometimes we have to take precautions. You know how it is," she stammered. Daniel's gaze locked onto hers. He could feel the sting of her assumption, based purely on the color of his skin. Instead of reacting in anger, he decided to play along to see how far she would push this. "So, if I don't pay now, I won't get served?" he asked, his voice steady. Jessica shifted uncomfortably and with a dismissive shrug said, "Look, if you can't afford it, there's a fast food place down the street." The tension between them grew, and several nearby customers started to notice the uncomfortable scene unfolding. Daniel, taking a deep breath, pulled out his wallet. He handed her a credit card, silently watching as she took it with a smug look on her face before walking off toward the register. A few moments later, the diner's manager, Mr. Harris, came rushing out from the back, his face pale and his eyes wide. "Mr. Carter," he exclaimed, his voice flustered, "I had no idea you were stopping by today." Jessica, who had just returned with the receipt, froze in her tracks. Daniel leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms with a calm but firm expression. "Apparently, I needed to pay before I could order," he said, his tone pointed. Mr. Harris's face drained of color as he glanced between Daniel and Jessica, his voice trembling. "That's not our policy." "I'm so sorry, sir." Jessica, clearly stunned, opened her mouth but no words came out. Daniel remained composed, his voice resolute. "I own this diner and 5 more just like it. So tell me, Jessica, why did you assume I needed to pay up front when no one else did?" Jessica stammered, I didn't mean anything by it. I just..." Her words trailed off. Mr. Harris turned sharply toward her, his voice tight with anger. "You know we don't do that here," he snapped. Daniel's voice was firm, but there was a weight to his words. "This isn't just about me. If I walked in here as a regular customer and was treated like this, how many others have you done the same to? How many people have you wrongly assumed couldn't pay?" Jessica's face turned a deep shade of red as she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Mr. Harris turned back to Daniel, his voice now more apologetic. "Sir, I assure you this will be handled immediately." Daniel nodded once, his face calm. "Good, because if there's one thing I won't tolerate in my restaurants, it's discrimination. Jessica, you're fired." Jessica's eyes widened in shock. "Please." "I didn't mean to," she began, but Daniel shook his head. "You made a choice, and now you're facing the consequences." With that, Jessica removed her apron, her face filled with regret, and walked out of the diner. Mr. Harris continued to apologize, but Daniel simply nodded, asking for a coffee. He had made his decision, and he knew that the diner would be better off without employees like Jessica. As he sipped his coffee, Daniel reflected on what had just happened. He had worked tirelessly to build his businesses, and he would never let anyone treat others differently based on their background. That day, Maplewood Diner changed for the better, and Daniel knew that it was a step in the right direction. The next time Daniel visited the diner, he made sure to walk in just as he had before. Because after all, the true test of a business wasn't how it looked when people were watching, but how it treated every customer, no matter who they were.